Going to start. Okay, I think we are live. So thank you for anyone who is joining us today. This is the Censored Journalism series. And the point of this series is to bring voices together to talk about censor-enabled journalism. It's an emergent practice, but by no means isn't an established one yet. It's kind of the point of this is to bring together practitioners and people who are doing some deep thinking about how censored journalism might work to work through some of the salient issues that we're all confronting in this space. So ultimately, we're looking at questions like, what does this mean for the practice of journalism sharing? And in some ways, it's exciting to be in this new territory, but on the other hand, it's even more important to be critical of it and anticipate some and its limits. And so this series is co-hosted by Alex Fink of the Open I'm a graduate student at MIT Comparative Media Studies, and we're hoping to explore different aspects of censored journalism each weekend in March by bringing speakers to this series, very much like this today. All the sessions are going to be archived and made available on the Censored Journalism webpage, which we will send out at the end, and that's going to help contribute to the growing body of knowledge about this field. And today is kind of a special event. It's a pre-kickoff to the entire series, and we're live with Fergus Pitt, who is currently a researcher at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. He has recently led a program of work investments as reporting tools, and it's now culminated in a report called Censors and Journalism, which I highly recommend that you read. He is primarily a with experience building online and mobile products, and he has also worked with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and has his master's and BA in journalism. But that's enough talking from me. I'm just going to toss it over to Fergus to tell you a little bit more about his work.
Oh, thanks, Lily. And I've just got to say that this is it's a really interesting series that you've put together, that you and Alex have put together. I'm looking forward to a lot of the topics in the kind of coming weeks. So this project, or this kind of line of work for us has kind of got its origins in a set of observations that we were making here at the journalism school. And you know, the first of that is that journalists are more and more using data in their practice. Here at the Columbia Journalism School, we've got something like 40% of students who are taking a data subject. 5 years ago it was none, and we're very much kind of looking at what the industry's doing with data, and the fact that data teams and news apps teams are becoming, they're relatively widespread in journalism organisations. The big conferences like NICAR, which is going to be held this year in a couple of weeks down at Atlanta, these conferences are kind of overflowing their bounds. The mailing lists for data journalism are becoming huge. So data, it barely needs to be said now, is an intrinsic part of journalism, and that means that more and more journalists are kind of have this demand for data. So that's the kind of first observation that underpins this. Another one is that sensors have, absolutely become embedded in our cities, in our homes, in our devices. Famously, your phone will have, 5 or 6 sensors in it. It's not unusual for factories to be using sensors to regulate industrial processes. Civic infrastructure like roads, there are sensor processes that allow cities to be managed. So you've got, on the supply side, sensors kind of creating a huge amount of data at the same time as journalists are becoming hungry for it. And the third observation is that there's this ecosystem of very broad technical skills, of cheap raw electronic parts and industrial supply lines that have become more accessible, largely through the internet, that really stimulate this kind of maker community. So you've got 3 things going on there. The first, demand for data from journalism and becoming part of the practice. sensors being part of our world, being very widespread in our world, and an ecosystem of technical skills to bring those things together. And so that made us think, well, sensors are ultimately a way of collecting information about the world. That is one of the things that journalists do. Presumably, there should be a way to really look at sensors and journalism in combination and see if this is a relevant thing. One of the ways in which we talk about it is we're very careful about how we kind of name it. We don't really like to use the word a separate kind of label as sensor journalism. We kind of keep emphasising to our students and the people that we work with that it's sensors and journalism. This is an extension of a potential extension of the craft rather than a whole separate field. That really comes down to brass tacks when you know that you kind of benefit from broadening the picture provided by data by cross-checking, getting another source, bringing in the stories of people, which tend to be the things that make our journalism kind of memorable, even if the data gives us the clarity of the picture and illustrates some kind of new truth. So out of those kinds of ideas came the Sensor Journalism Report, and it lays out some of those landscape, a picture of the landscape that I just talked about, and then it goes into a range of case studies. The earliest case study is actually more than 10 years old. The Houston Chronicle almost more than 10 years ago hung a whole lot of pollution badges around a community that they thought was at risk so that they could produce data shedding a little bit more light on whether about whether the local industrial processes were putting these communities at harm. Then there are some there are other case studies, including the Sun Sentinel's accessing of toll booth data, obviously RFID sensors, to show that the police in Florida were habitually using their off-duty cars to speed and break the law. And what I think was particularly interesting about that story that sensors could help with that other journalistic processes couldn't was that it showed that this was not the case of a few bad apples. It really showed that this was widespread. The Sun Sentinel collected more than 6,000 examples of police going more than 30 miles per hour over the speed limit. So that's that kind of massive data that can be shown to provide a somewhat different angle on the story than actually just saying, well, here's a single example or another example. Those singular examples might still be needed to give the story, I suppose, a certain texture, but the data provided a very broad, a damning picture of the whole, of a large part of the police department down there. So those were a couple of the case studies, and there are, I think, 6 or 7 more in there. We looked at some of the legal and ethical issues, ranging from privacy and surveillance to potential safety and negligence, and then some of the issues that fall somewhere between legal and ethical and codes of practice, and that's to do with accuracy and epistemology. Obviously, at the very top of most countries' codes of ethics for journalism is this idea of accuracy, the idea that you really, you must be telling a story that is true, and that's got very interesting implications when you're talking about sensors, which collect information from the world in a very particular way. It can be incredibly useful, but there's also some things that it can't do. So that was the shape of the report, and it was really pleasing to see after the report came out, people such as yourself, Lily, kind of extended onto the ideas by producing things like a typology of reporting processes, of sensor reporting processes, and indeed that work that you did, Lily, has fed into some more thinking about some of the components that in fact, I'm including in a curriculum that I'm delivering this weekend. And I'm pleased to talk about some of that a little bit further on.
That's fantastic. Sorry, I think I lost service for a second, and now I'm back. I think I'm going to take a moment here to let everyone who is viewing this broadcast know that there is a way to submit questions. If you go to your left module and click on the Q&A app, you can submit your questions, but Alex is going to lead with some to kind of get the discussion going, and feel free to submit your questions in the meantime.
Cool. Well, Fergus, one of the things that I thought was so interesting about the Censors in Journalism report was the piece that you just talked about it being censors and journalism and not censor journalism. And it makes me think we wrongly titled the webinar series here. But the first question that I had that you kind of detail in the report, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about here, is the history of censors in journalism. I think that it's so interesting to think about the fact that this isn't part of a new technology. It's just the fact that there's a whole bunch of different and new censors that are available now that can be integrated into the work of journalism. And I think that's a really fascinating thing for people to hear about, because censors have been around for a very, very long time, which you point out in the report.
Yeah. So the report doesn't include a comprehensive history of censors in journalism. And as we know, the definition of journalism is somewhat contested. But the points that I guess the patterns that I would see is that there's been, especially in investigative journalism, something of a tradition of testing. The Houston Chronicle example that I talked about was quite old now, where they hung the badges up, is a little bit related to some. There's journalism that has been done, for example, on logs crossing borders, where people have taken a sample of the wood to say, this is from a particular area of the world that isn't meant to be logged. So, by virtue of that, these logs are legal. So there seems to be something about environmental types of journalism that use this idea of kind of collecting data. In those early examples, quite small sets of data. And I think as these electronic types of sensing are becoming more available, you start to see, or rather, as these electronic forms of data collection are becoming more available, you start to see it move into the language of sensors where it's much larger sets of data. So there's a kind of the environmental testing is almost like an older sister or an older brother of the kind of way that we're seeing sensors be used now. A recent piece by ProPublica where they used remote sensing or satellites to illustrate a really fantastic picture of how the Louisiana coast is receding has, as an older brother, work done by Matt Waite, again in Florida, where he showed the coastline receding there. So there is a lot of sensor technology that's becoming available and is being increasingly used by the citizen science community, but there is as you kind of hinted at and as you were expecting, there's a history of sensing of all different kinds in journalism. Goes back many years.
Can you say something about some of the sensors that folks are using? Because I think that for those who are new to the subject, the idea of a camera being a sensor is a really basic one, but what are some of the things that people are using now that you're talking about, like satellite imagery or sensors on tolls or something like that? Can you name a few of them and kind of spell out the ways that they're being used as examples?
Yeah, I might come at that question, if you don't mind, through a slightly different route. But I promise you that I'll get to that question. It's been really useful for us to establish a kind of language around different types of journalism. So this isn't necessarily the different types of reporting processes that Lily did some fantastic work on. It's more about just saying that in journalism generally, you have different types of work. What I mean by this is, investigative or accountability work, where you'll have, say, the Sun Sentinel using city RFID tags. Some more kind of illustrative or explanatory journalism, and this is where you see ProPublica's work or Washington Post's pulling in data from microphones which are triggered by gunshots. Then you've kind of got participatory journalism or breaking news journalism, or kind of profiles. These are all kinds of things that you open a news website on any day and you'll see a package of the combination of these kinds of things. Now, in any one of those different types of journalism, different kinds of sensors and different sensing processes are more useful or more suitable. Now, this is where I'm kind of coming back to this kind of question of sensor types. Alex, thanks for bearing with me. In the kind of participatory journalism or participatory civic media, you start to see people doing relatively inexpensive environmental data collection. It might be particulate monitors or particulate air quality monitors, where you're looking for very fine grains of dust in the air, called PM2.5. That's the kind of dust that can get into people's lungs and increases the risk factor for a whole host of respiratory problems, or larger, PM10, which is kind of like the dust that kind of makes life unpleasant, it gets in your eyes, it's gritty, or volatile organic compounds, the kind of benzene and methane and alcohol. And these are all relatively cheap sensors that can be relatively widely deployed. If you were trying to do a piece of investigative journalism, the type of sensor that you might want to use is a very well calibrated, professionally produced, widely understood, scientifically verifiable sensor that works by, USA Today, when they did their Ghost Factories investigation, they hired a series of sensors that work by basically firing beams of energy into the ground, and then what happens to those atoms in the material tells you whether it's lead or whether it's a different kind of material. But then there are a whole range of kind of really simple sensors like accelerometers or temperature and humidity, or microphones that can tell you the noise level. If you open up an electronics catalog, you'll see all of these different kinds of sensors, and it's really down to the kind of imagination and logic of innovative journalists as to how these things can be used. But not all of them are suitable for every type of journalism. Some of the more cutting-edge exploratory work that might be done by a maker community might not be suitable for investigative journalism, because the epistemological bar has got to be very high.
Right.
So, I was going to say, we have a question from the audience here.
Yeah, we do have one. So this is from Puneet, who is listening, and he says, if sensors have been around for such a long time, what is it that makes this phase of this phenomenon so unique? So what is setting this apart from traditional uses of sensors? And maybe what is the distinction between sensors in journalism versus data journalism, if there is one in your speculation?
I think so. There are, to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. There's a moment here where sensors becoming electronic means that you're producing information that looks like data. So it's integrating with all of these computational processes that are happening in journalism at the moment. I think that's one reason why it seems to be worth paying attention to this integration of sensors in journalism. I would also kind of hesitate to say that we're really seeing a very widespread use of sensors in journalism. So that means I'd hesitate to say that we're necessarily in a phase or a moment of a trend. I think we're at an earlier stage than that. But we're starting to see some green shoots that suggest that there are opportunities for journalism, and that as a few more things fall into place, like calibration processes for cheap sensors,
right,
that may well open up possibilities for illustrative or explanatory or investigative journalism that uses cheap, widespread sensors.
I have another question, maybe tagged on to that. I'm curious about, I think some of these projects are taken on by larger newsrooms and that have pretty significant financial backing. I know some of the projects you talk about in the report have $20,000 or more invested in them, which is pretty significant, I think, for any sort of project. What does it take to build and maintain a censor journalism project kind of in general? I know that it's probably different for each of them, but is that sustainable going into the future for newsrooms of various sizes to maintain something like that, or is it really going to have to change how we organize news organizations if we're going to really integrate this kind of journalism in a bigger way?
Yeah, you put your finger on one of the big questions here. A lot of the reason that we put very detailed information about the price and the cost of some of these journalistic projects in was to give readers and working journalists and newsroom leaders the chance to kind of go, okay, well, this is something that my newsroom can take advantage of, whereas this might be something that we do once a year or in partnership. From where we sit, it's very hard to kind of say, okay, and be prescriptive and say, yeah, well, yes, you can definitely afford this kind of journalism. The one thing that I would say is that knowing that there are networks of sensors embedded in the cities, and once you start to get that realization and you walk through your city and you see the sensors, or you get an understanding of where they are, it maybe allows you to ask different kind of questions and file different freedom of information requests or applications. So, and again, I think it comes back a lot to the different, what the ambition for your type of journalism is. A journalistic type that we didn't talk that we haven't talked very much about, and actually isn't in the book, is the idea of a kind of journalistic profile. And you can imagine that some of the consumer level sensors, like a Fitbit or just a simple kind of location tracker, might be the kind of thing that can shed some new light on an individual's character. And I can imagine that if telling a kind of profile story was something that your newsroom was interested in, there are some opportunities for using sensors to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious whether you think that the main future of this is going to be in kind of the investigative and muckraking style of journalistic activity, because I think a lot of the case studies that you highlight and a lot of what I've seen has been folks in that it almost borders on the line between journalism and activism, and a lot of it ends up in a political space, and you mentioned that in the report. And I'm curious whether the one that you just named sounds like it could potentially not be very political necessarily, but I think many of the other ones that you've demonstrated are political. So I'm curious whether you think that's part of the major future of censors in journalism, or in this way that you're talking about it, or is there going to be a lot more options?
No, I think there are probably a lot more kind of case studies to be written about journalistic projects that use sensors that aren't necessarily investigative. I think the illustrative or the explanatory types of journalism have got very interesting potential for sensors. I think breaking news has got very interesting potential. And in terms of breaking news, you can I can imagine sensing of software systems, what you might call kind of virtual sensors that have got some really interesting possibilities. And within particular networks, like financial news, that's really already happening. You're seeing people respond very quickly to information that has been picked up by essentially a sensor running in financial markets and going, oh, this just happened. We need to respond. We need to spread information. So I think I think that there are all kinds of different journalistic genres that can leverage sensors. The report is probably a little bit overweight in terms of the investigative and the accountability stuff, but as the work goes forward, maybe that we do some more case studies of other different types.
Well, here's a related question from Cosmin in the audience. What capacity needs to be built if you're going to start really involving sensors in journalistic activity from scratch? And so what would you need to add to your newsroom? What matters most? What limitations are you going to face right away?
I think that I would probably turn that question around somewhat to say, once you start having an appreciation of what sensors are and what they can do, then really it's a question of if you have a story that you want to tell, knowing that there's this tool that can help me tell this particular story. That said, the types of stories that newsrooms that have large numbers of data journalists can tell might be applicable. So to put that a little bit more clearly, you really always want your I think you want your journalistic process to follow your strategy, your editorial strategy, rather than have your editorial strategy be technologically determined.
Mm-hmm.
So just drawing that out a little bit more, I think that if you do have people who are technically inclined, having the time to develop an awareness of what sensor technology is about, what it can do, what it can't do, is a worthwhile investment. And it's likely that if you have developers in your newsroom, which we think is a good idea, those are the people that you may want to be kind of tasking with developing up those skills.
Because it takes a new kind of creativity to make this work, right? Like you have to have, as you said, imagination, a different kind of imagination as a journalist to to kind of come up with these ideas where you would even think to go take some sensors and put them out in the world in some way and start gathering data, or to look for data that's already out there. It's a very different way of thinking about the work that you do.
That's right, and it's also unlike other types of data journalism, it can be also very expensive because you are using consumable bits of equipment.
Mm-hmm.
If the model of sensor journalism that you're talking about is to put an object out of the world, if you're accessing existing sensor networks or you're recruiting crowds in to provide data, then the costs might look a little bit different.
I think another related question, especially since you work in education in this area, would be what should a student that's entering a journalism school now be looking for in that journalism school in regards to sensors, and what should they be angry if they don't get as part of their education?
I think you'd be. I need to be careful here because the last thing that I want to do is assume that I know a lot about other journalist schools' situations. I can say that at the Columbia Journalism School there's been a very big investment in data courses, and references to sensors and knowing that there are sensor networks are a part of those data courses. And I think that at the moment, where this is a nascent field and this is a rapidly developing field, you probably don't need to do a huge amount more than that. We do know that the field of journalism is changing, will continue to change, and with that, all kinds of journalist skills need to kind of continually be developed through their kind of careers. So awareness and a kind of start and an interest in sensors perhaps now, but then be expecting to kind of pull those skills in as the practice of integrating sensors with your journalism develops maybe over the next 15 to 20 years.
Cool.
Great. We have another question from the audience, and this is from Willie. He wants to know, what is the relationship between remote sensing using satellite imagery and ground-based monitoring with sensors and beyond? What role do journalists have to play in the ground verification of satellite data?
And do you think you could take that a level higher too as you answer? So maybe to answer that specific question, but then also to answer, I think a lot of people will have the question about what role are journalists playing, and then what role do others need to play as this data is gathered and then used in practice? Yeah,
and yet again, I kind of go back to it's going to be slightly different depending on the type of journalism genre that you're working towards. We put a very big emphasis on journalists taking on the responsibility to ground truth whatever the data tells them, whether it's remote sensing or sensing that's out, down at ground level, if you like, and not just to kind of check whether the data that your sensor has collected is true, but also go and talk to the people who are in and around the spaces and the stories that the sensors are collecting data on. Sensors collect data in a certain way around the world, and it's unlikely that they will have the same subtlety and artistry of the information they collect that you'll get by talking to somebody and asking for their impressions. And that ability to talk to people and to observe the world with humanity is something that journalists are exceptional at. And while journalists may decide, or a journalist or an editor might decide on what the story that they're going to investigate is, or what the topic that they're going to explore over the next year's worth of stories is. And in doing that and saying, okay, well, we think that sensors have got an opportunity to help us tell that story, you might decide to go and partner and drive a partnership with scientific experts. I think journalists can take core, singular, direct responsibility for going and collecting personal stories that broaden and colour and put and give perspective to the data that come from sensors. It's not to say that people who self-identify as journalists can't also be being makers and building tools that collect data for them. But again, that's very much depending. That you may not be able to kind of produce evidence that's strong enough to stand up in court if you're a journalist who's relatively inexperienced with making electronic sensing equipment.
Yeah, I think Willie's question also brings up this interesting concept of using existing sensor networks or existing sensor nodes, for example, ones that are on a satellite, in conjunction with some ground truthing or a mode of participatory sensing for, I don't have a specific example. I'm not talking about any specific project, but in order to get more resolution, because sometimes existing networks will be spread out over distance, and you don't quite have the local resolution that you would want to tell a story. If you had an air sensing network across the city of Boston, and the closest one to you was 2 miles away, knowing what the air is like 2 miles away might not be very helpful to you where you're standing now. And so enabling people to kind of help collect data about the local environments, I think, is a model that has been talked about, and I don't know if it's actually been tried, but in terms of where the technology could go, I think there are more opportunities to explore fixed and mobile sensing kinds of data collection models, which might be very interesting in terms of reporting on environmental issues and perhaps even public health issues that are very much closer to the body. I think there are two companies. One is called Propeller Health, and there's another one called Nexus 6, which is based in New Zealand, and they produce these, what do they call it? Inhalers, and whenever you actuate the inhalers, they'll log a signal and say that a person in this general area has used the inhaler. And so a database of inhaler use compared against another database of air quality in that same region might be an interesting thing to look at. And if you're doing an environmental story about air pollution, it could be an interesting way to investigate that data and present it. Oh, sorry, I have been babbling.
Oh, very interesting.
We have another question from the audience. This is from Michael. This is Michael in Raleigh. I grew up in Southern California where forest fires and arson happen multiple times per year. In your opinion, will breaking news organizations begin capturing and presenting fire telemetry data to audiences? And this is where the audience has kind of built up an expectation of you to be a prophet in some sense for censors in journalism. Don't feel like you have to be, but you know.
I think that's an excellent idea.
Yeah.
And you know, the LA Times over there is incredibly innovative. The work that they did with QuakeBot was you know, it's the example that springs to mind when you think about breaking news and censors.
So you can't speak to exactly when that's coming around, huh?
We were counting on you, Fergus. Can you tell us a little bit more about the scale of different types of sensors that are out there? There are some that are very close to the body, like Fitbits, and those are very personalized, and it's a very individualized type of technology. But then moving beyond that, there's the development of Internet of Things, where the objects around us are going to be increasingly networked and accessible online. Then beyond that, perhaps, is environmental sensing on a very local level, and then beyond that, perhaps at a city scale, and then satellite networks. Like how do those types of scales feed into storytelling, and what do you think is possible? What do you think is still a little bit tricky? Just to get your opinion.
Well, I think that kind of continuum that you've just illustrated and articulated, really well, is particularly useful when journalists are thinking about how I've got this story that I want to tell. How am I going to report it? How am I going to collect data for it? And if sensors pops into their mind there, knowing that. The immediate thing that I think about might be a sensor that's like very close to me or in the room, but knowing that there's a continuum of distance along which sensors can be found may open up some possibilities as you're walking through the world and thinking about, these are all the things around here that are collecting data. As you say, on the body, in the room, in the block, at the city level, then out to space, as ProPublica's Losing Ground work did, is interesting. And then, of course, you've got the possibility of drones collecting data, and the recent announcement by the FAA about what their proposed standards are going to be suggests that there are opportunities that look a little bit more liberal for journalists to deploy drones than we thought that it might have been maybe a year ago.
I'm curious about the data that comes out of many of these projects. I know some of it ends up being open and other people can play with and analyze it. And other data, ends up kind of being within the news organization. And I know that some of the folks that wrote essays for the Censors in Journalism report brought up questions about whether that data should be reused for other purposes or whether it should be saved or stored, how. And I'm curious whether you see one of the modes of delivery of news even changing going into the future. I think this relates back to that fire question and naming where fire is happening and various data that comes up around that. As people and audiences become more data savvy, do you think that the ways that news gets delivered are going to change dramatically as more and more censors get involved in the process?
So I think this is a question that may want to be filtered through the kind of constituencies and audiences and communities that different kinds of news organisations and different kinds of information organisations see themselves serving. In the report, you've got one attitude articulated by the Washington Post, who are, of course, phenomenal news organisation, and the lead journalist on the ShotSpotter project. He didn't want to release the data that he'd gotten from FOIA ShotSpotter directly, and his rationale, which makes perfect sense for the needs of his news organisation and how he saw his audience, were twofold. One was that he didn't feel that they had the resources to verify that the information was up to date, and they didn't want to be making representations. His view was that the release of that data was really the city's responsibility, and he would help people out by saying, well, this is what you should potentially put in your FOIA request so that you get the most up-to-date data. But his view was that the greatest value that he could provide was to pull out a story of that data based on his experience and his understanding of what his community's needs were, and tell that story based on and so that's kind of one that's one end of, again, a spectrum. At the other end, you've got, for example, what's being done in Chicago with building the array of things, which I think is the subject of a later one of your series, where you've got a group of people, an entity, which don't necessarily see themselves as journalists, but they are in the business of producing information, and they are releasing all of their data because they believe that they will support an ecosystem of systems and people and tools that can pull information out and use it in some way that's kind of relevant for them. So the decision on the form at which you release your data is very much informed by the mission of your organisation and your community and who you're seeking to serve. And let's face it, also your business model.
I'll go ahead, Lily.
No, I just wanted to go back to Michael's question very quickly. Julia, who is G-chatting me and is involved in a censors and journalism project herself, just brought to my attention a story that she did in 2008 about a network of censors in Kenya. That it's a project that the EU is leading to kind of sense wildfire activity to protect just ecological territory. So, Michael, I just wanted to throw that out there in case you're still listening.
Yeah,
that is a type of project that is going on. So thank you, Julia, too, for bringing that up. And sorry for my horrible summary of it. I'm sure that I'll have a link to send out later that summarizes it much more eloquently.
Yeah, seeing that link on the Censor Journalism Lab page, it'd be great.
Fergus, I was going to follow up on something you just said. I think one of the major things that's changing here is the business model of these kinds of stories. Anyway, if you're investing a large amount of money in this as a news organization, you're having to find ways that this ends up becoming either a new business model or drawing more people into your site or into your news publication of whatever variety it is. What are the new kinds of business models that are emerging beyond the traditional forms that are supporting the use of censors more heavily in journalism, or are those kinds of things emerging yet?
That's not really a question that we've linked to censors. We are. I was talking to an investigative editor today, and even though the organisation that he worked for is new and is very profitable, and is avowedly commercial, he didn't need to think directly about revenue questions, and that's a good space for journalism to be. If you're lucky enough to be in that situation, that's a lucky and skilled enough to be in that situation. That's a good situation to be in. So we haven't seen a lot of and we haven't really gone looking, to be perfectly fair, we haven't seen a lot of examples of business models tied directly to sensing, to sensors and journalistic practice. Might be a subject for a later episode of your series.
Indeed. I'm curious if you could say, too, I was wondering about this question earlier, and I think others have brought up stuff that's kind of connected to this. What kinds of collaborations with academic institutions are occurring, or other folks like think tanks who are typically involved in research that uses these kinds of sensors because they have the funding to do it? Are there collaborations that are emerging? Are those sort of a part of the future of journalism in a bigger way than they have been in the past? And what do those kinds of collaborations look like?
You're asking very broad questions. You know, they're great. The one thing I would note is that collaborations between universities and journalism organisations tend to be quite difficult rather, because the universities have got a process called the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and if you're doing systematic research, and especially if you're doing stuff that involves people, you need to go through a very broad ethical review process, and of course, you know, no journalist wants to be doing something unethical, but the kinds of concerns and the kinds of timings and the rhythms of those are very different from journalism institutions. So the relationships that you tend to see tend to be advising rather than really tight collaborations on investigations. You know, there are a couple of examples. The Mailman School is collaborating with WNYC on some pollution and some health work, but there, you know, it's not an easy path.
Lily, we have another question here too. One that I don't understand. Maybe you understand it.
I can't. Oh, Bloomberg terminals. Fergus, does that make any sense to you?
Well, I wonder if that was in reference to the idea of software sensing in financial systems.
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy called Eric Scott Hunslander who is a high frequency trading analyst, whose work is he does what I would describe as software sensing in financial markets. He wouldn't describe himself as a journalist, but he does distribute a lot of information based on movements that trigger something for him that he wants to explain.
Cool.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions in the audience? I noticed that more and more people are starting to trickle in towards the end of the hour. And these have been fantastic so far. And they've really helped us guide the conversation across. It's a nice tour of the different topics that we hope to hit in the rest of this series in March. So thank you for your very, very thoughtful engagement.
And one of the questions that I think we're also hoping to hit in this series and kind of throughout is going to be about the ethics of censors in journalism. And I know that, you know, I've been asking these general questions, which in part I think is a little bit of my role here, because I'm trying to figure out how do we talk about censors in journalism to a really broad audience. And I think it's good to have that balance of these really specific questions and these really general ones. The Censors in Journalism report, I think, does a great job of detailing from 6, I think, different perspectives about what kinds of takes you can have on ethics in various ways in journalistic practice using censors. I'm wondering if you can comment briefly on a few of those to kind of give the lay of the land of what kinds of ethical questions folks are working with as they think about this territory.
Yeah, so we found it useful to kind of think about the legal and ethical issues in 4 broad buckets. One was around privacy and surveillance. You know, if you're deploying a sensor network, what obligations do you have to not invade somebody's privacy? and to not just extend the surveillance state. And there are notable gaps in what's legal and what might run up against people's ethical boundaries in that particular environment. The next bucket is really in the safety and the negligence area, and that's very much about the physicality of sensors. It comes into play particularly when there are drones or kind of or objects that you're putting out into the physical environment that somebody might trip over. And the ethics around that are obviously very clear. Don't hurt people. And the legal traditions there tend to be very tort-based, going back to sacks of flour falling out of windows. Then you start getting into the IP and licensing questions, and that's really about if you're making sensors or using sensors, making sure that you're falling within intellectual property. And if you're making sensors, the ethical side of that is, well, should I be open sourcing my work so that it can be feeding into a greater ecosystem in the same way that no doubt as a maker you've worked with other people's property that they've passed into the community. And the I'm just going to go to my notes here. And the other big ethical and legal issue is really around accuracy and epistemology, and you start getting into kind of questions of defamation here. There's a legal concept in the USA of false light. If you're portraying a negative view of somebody that doesn't adequately, that doesn't tell the whole story, you're telling a story in false light, and that is not only unethical, but it can get you into kind of defamation problems. And that's also where you kind of get into the questions of, okay, needing to ground truth things. You have I believe you have an ethical obligation to go and talk to the people around whom you are collecting data. So there's four broad buckets there. And the one thing that I would also say is that those legal and ethical buckets may be places where journalists can start looking for stories themselves, because of course journalists aren't the only people collecting data and aren't the only people using sensors. It may be that if there is a sensor network that a journalist feels is running up against those legal and ethical issues, there's a story there, and there are a lot of journalists there are a lot of people who have reservations about the shot spotter system. Is the data, is the information that is collecting asymmetrical? Is it being used for benefit of one particular group, but even though it's collecting data about other groups?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I wonder, you run into similar questions too, even if someone's not a professional journalist. It's so easy to be an amateur journalist in some ways, or I don't know what the proper word for that is, but you run into this trouble of like folks who are all jumping into the space without the training or background or knowledge even of some of the problems or pitfalls that they might run into as they're trying to do this stuff.
And it's interesting, as somebody who's working in a journalistic institution, I tend to reference the journalistic codes of ethics. There are also codes of ethics for computer scientists and scientists. And one of the notes in the code of ethics of computer science is not claiming expertise beyond what you have, which I think is kind of fascinating, and it's an interesting thing to focus on.
And it's almost that those are really exciting, but you run into the trouble of like the folks who are not in this world. And I think this applies to me, for example. I'm not a journalist, and I don't consider myself a journalist, but I do sort of journalistic activity and interviewing a bunch of people and producing stories about what's going on in the open knowledge movement. But I wouldn't know the first thing about any of the journalistic ethics or any of the concerns about that you bring up, I think, about ethics in the report, about the different sorts of trouble that you can get yourself in as someone who's reporting using sensors in the world. And that seems really important that you've brought them up here, but I don't think that's common knowledge that people might run into these problems.
Yeah.
If they're putting sensors out there and trying to report on information.
I mean, the nice thing is that, in this era, there's just so much of that information available online. It's trivial for me, who's somebody who's not a computer scientist, to go and look at the computer scientist's code of ethics. And there are some tensions between the computer scientist's code of ethics and, for instance, journalistic practice. One of the things that's in the computer scientist's code of ethics is you shouldn't do any work that causes harm to people. Now, there is a lot of investigative journalism and accountability journalism that absolutely causes harm to people. The investigative journalists would argue that that harm is deserved and it is to serve a greater civic good. But it's not always quite as easy as these things are not black and white.
Right, exactly. Well, we're getting close to, I think, the close here, and I'm wondering if you can just give us, this part I don't think is in the report, you give a good series of recommendations for people to be thinking about. But I wonder if you could just give us, and things have changed, I think, since you released this maybe a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can give us like 3 predictions going out 5 or 10 years about how the field of journalism will look different because of the involvement of sensors in it.
Yeah. I think the first one is that personal profiles are going to be added to by sensor data. That's one. I think we're going to see a lot more news generated out of phenomena that are going on in our IP networks. I don't mean intellectual property, I mean internet protocol networks. The flow of bits backwards and forwards triggering news. I think that's something that we're likely to see. And I think the third is that there will be news generated and knowledge generated and illustrations and explanations based on more and more sensors in our cities.
I was trying to mute myself there so I didn't make a bunch of extra noise, but I silently said that sounds awesome. And I'm curious about, as we close here, what was one question you were really hoping someone would ask you, or that you would hope someone would have asked you here, and what would be your answer to it?
The question that I would have loved to hear was, can you come and have a look at my fantastic new sensor journalism project? The answer would have been, absolutely, I can't wait to see it.
I can't wait to hear that one either. So if anyone wants to ask it in the near future, feel free to.
Well, one of the things that's happened as we've started to organize this, I think Lily can attest to as well, is that folks have come out of the woodworks, and folks that we've connected with to help promote the events have said, oh, by the way, we have about 10 other people you should talk to in this. So we've been considering, do we extend this, or do you have a second one, or what do you do to bring in all these different voices of folks that are coming into this area or making new innovations in the area. So hopefully we can connect you to some of those folks too, Fergus.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to pay tribute to you two guys. The network that we've seen emerge out of the mailing list that Lily's started up has been really phenomenal.
Well, thank you. I think a lot of the people who are listening right now are on that list, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful to be in dialogue with you all as we kind of craft the critique around this field together. It's been very, very, very illuminating, to say the very least. Yeah. So thank you so much, Fergus, for joining us. It's been an honor to speak with you, as always, and I'm looking forward to what you come up with next and future lines of inquiry along this realm of research. It's very exciting, and I look forward to being able to include sensor data in my Twitter profile.
Cheerio.
And for everyone who's listening, the sensorjournalism.okcast.org is the site to go to see the archive of this video and to see the schedule for the upcoming videos. And this interview with Fergus has been kind of a preview to what's coming over the next month, starting on March 8th. So join us for that.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good night.